IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of your favorite daily public policy podcast, the Takshashila Institution's All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and today I'm joined by Dr. Shambhavi Naik, who's the head of research at the institution and also a co-chair for the sixth task force of the G20's Think20 initiative, the sixth task force being accelerating sustainable development goals, exploring new pathways to the 2030 agenda. Welcome, Shambhavi.
Hi, Anushka. Hello to all the listeners.
So, I think this would be an interesting conversation because I'd like to understand from you your experience. With regards to working with the Think 20, and what exactly does this initiative and working group entail? How exactly do the suggestions that are formulated under various policy briefs submitted to the Think 20 function? And what does the G20 ultimately do with those recommendations? I'd also like to know from you what your personal experience was interacting with some of the conferences that were held under the Think 20 initiative, and what is the future of this initiative and the policy suggestions that were made to this. So, Shambhavi, I think my first question to you would be, could you tell our listeners a little bit about what the Think 20 is and what is its mandate? What roles does it entail? Over
Right.
to you.
Thank you, Anushka. So the Think 20, or it is more popularly known as T20,
Yeah.
is supposed to be the ideas bank for the G20. It was started in 2012 by the Mexican presidency, who initiated this idea that let's get think tanks from around the globe together to provide the G20 leaders with good ideas to then discuss at the G20 summit. As you can imagine, Mexico probably did not have the idea of T20, being there being another popular form of T20,
Mhm.
and that T20 immediately resonates with the G20. So when I first got an invitation to be co-chair, I must confess I also did not know that the T20 existed outside of cricket.
Right.
And I was at Brussels airport, getting back to India, uh, and I got the email saying from the chairman of the T20 saying, "Would you we would like to invite you to be co-chair?" And I actually had to spend 15 minutes time to figure out
Right.
what this was, right? But now over the past few months of working at the T20, I've got a fairly bit more realization of what the T20 actually is. So it is a grouping of experts around the world of the G20, and in case of India's presidency, we also invited people from outside the G20 to be a part of committees to discuss individual topics, or rather individual areas, and then to kind of shortlist ideas which could be of consequence for the G20 and for the world, that we feel that the G20 leaders should really be discussing, right? So it's kind of an agenda setting forum. By no means is it the only sub forum of the G20. You have Women 20, Business 20, Startup 20
Right.
within India initiated, etc. So it's part of that bunch of groupings which is supposed to feed in ideas for the G20. And so then, as you can imagine, we start once the G20 presidency comes to a certain country,
Mhm.
but we have to end our process a few months before the G20 presidency ends, because we really want time for the G20 leaders to take up the ideas, to discuss what, to shortlist what they might end up actually taking forward, right? And this is a parallel process that happens with the G20 task or G20 meetings itself, right? So it's a separate grouping in that sense. And what we've been doing obviously is meeting and discussing. Since it's an ideas bank, the T20 does not at any point of time kind of profess that we are the best. We outsource a lot of the idea making. We have a call for abstracts from around the world, and then we look through those ideas and then we shortlist and then we take things forward.
Right. I think that this working group is especially interesting because for the kind of work we do at Takshashila, it's important that governmental and interministerial conferences and groupings like the G20 give a platform to, like you said, outsource policy thinking and ideas and innovation. And of course, as one of the co-chairs for the sixth task force, what would you say were the main agenda items or work streams that were discussed under this particular task force, and what kind of value would you attach to the work streams that were selected under, say, the idea of accelerating SDGs?
Right. Let me just take a step back and just for the Indian T20. So each T20 presidency usually chooses the task force areas that they want. India chose seven different task forces. I won't go through all of them, but they broadly look at macroeconomics. The new one I think that we brought out was lifestyle for environment, which was task force three, and the idea that if you want a sustainable future, you have to at some point also start tempering consumption, and that's going to be a very important facet of how the world grows together. And so we had seven different task forces, and I was co-chair along with several others for task force 6, like you said, accelerating sustainable development goals, which is such a broad area if you think about it, because literally everything under the sun falls under sustainable development goals. As long as we want to have a future under the sun, everything gets subsumed in that,
Right.
right? For me personally, it was a very interesting sort of process because I got to work with representatives from South Africa, Malaysia, Brazil, Russia, um, obviously from India. And so it was very interesting to see perspectives coming out. There was a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences, particularly when you saw Global South voices in these fora, right? Um, and I think the overall value system that we kind of attached to this at the beginning was that, is this really relevant to the G20? How does the what power does G20 have that other groupings or even bigger groupings don't have, right? So how do you leverage that unique aspect of being G20? And really, I think it is also, I think till that point of time I had not realized how idea competitions work, because there are 10 really good ideas, but you know that the G20 leaders might only have time to think through three. uh, and so how you are given the tough task of then narrowing down. And I think that perspective that, hey, maybe the leaders also don't really have that much time. There's so many good ideas. When we called for abstracts, I think just for TF6 we got more than 300
Wow.
abstracts that we all had to read through, and obviously across our work streams included food security, nutrition, water security, promoting holistic outcomes in health, promoting biodiversity, gender sensitivity, and agenda 2030, which is literally how we live.
Right.
So under that habit, and it was quite exciting because we got abstracts from all over the world. And again, it was very interesting to see some of the similarities in the challenges that people feel. I think we sometimes feel that challenges are very unique to India,
Mhm.
but they are not. And it was kind of heartening to see that, hey, this seems to be like a global issue that we need to all tackle together, and therefore it matters to the G20. But it was also interesting to see how various researchers approached maybe the same problem. There were some which were very data centric, some which were not, some which were very abstract. So that, I think, was a very interesting learning experience for me.
Right. I mean, definitely that idea of ideas competition sounds like it would have led to deliberation and discussion on a lot of insights, but at the same time, it would also have led to a lot of ideas maybe being left as a springboard for future research and something that can be considered in the future by these governments and governmental officials
Right.
that
Let
have.
me just talk about the
Yeah.
process for a bit, how we actually filtered through this.
Yeah.
So when we got the abstracts, we obviously had these work streams which were predetermined. The abstracts were bucketed into their work streams, and each abstract was seen by at least two coaches or chairs.
Right.
And then we had a cumulative score. to kind of mark on how we evaluated the abstract. It was obviously whether it was going to be relevant to the G20, and something that the G20 should be pursuing. Because we saw a lot of, say, for example, pilot studies. We saw a lot of like very centric to a certain nation kind of a study, which we knew that the G20 might not be the best forum to take it forward.
Right.
Right. So, based on the relevance, based on the potential impact, based on the novelty of the idea, abstracts were then marked, and then eventually we shortlisted some at TF6. Then all of the abstracts were submitted to the T20 Secretariat. The T20 Secretariat then further shortlisted because only a certain number of ideas could be submitted to the G20 Secretariat
Right.
or be part of the T20 overall publication list. So we had two levels of filters and two levels of experts that had a look at these ideas. And I really think the ones that were chosen were the best, that were the most relevant to the G20.
Right. That certainly sounds like a competitive process and an elaborate experience. So I'm curious, from your personal experience, what did you find was a strategy, maybe not the best, but the most inclusive strategy to kind of bring the diverse set of ideas, not just with regards to the abstracts that were submitted, but with regards to what, say, your fellow co-chairs would think would be a more relevant or preferable idea as compared to perhaps what you or others would say, and used it to kind of circumvent some of the differences to bring out the best possible, most optimal outcomes.
Yeah, I think the ideas that we liked the most were ideas where there were a few institutions which had collaborated together for a study. Ideas which had done really deep literature review and been able to connect dots across literature. Um, Ideas which I think one of the interesting observations I had was that we got a lot of abstracts in health,
Right.
right? And a lot of abstracts in health said, oh, healthcare should be made available to everybody, which is not a novel idea. And what we wanted was unique ideas. I think everyone knows that healthcare should be available to
Yeah.
everybody, and it is very easy to put forth that idea. The problem has been with the implementation.
Mhm.
But on the flip side, if you look at something like promoting biodiversity, which is really actually key also to health and to
Mhm.
various other outcomes, we got very minimal number of abstracts and
Right.
ideas because it is not, I think not a hot topic, right? And you could see that we then had to make efforts to include biodiversity in, because as the T20 we cannot stand back and say that, hey, there are no abstracts here, let's not go, it is
Right.
not an important enough topic, because as chairs and co-chairs we felt that this was going to be really critical. Whereas health, obviously, as we come out of COVID, has been a more hot topic for people
Right.
to think about and have ideas for. We obviously made sure that there was inclusion at the level of gender,
Mhm.
and also when there were student participations, we actually got
Yeah.
a lot of PhD students also writing in.
Mhm.
So I think there were efforts made to ensure that we had an even balance within the areas, the work streams that we were given, and the kind of ideas that were coming through.
Right. I think two really interesting personal observations that I made from what you said. One was with regards to the fact that your idea has to be relevant, but at the same time unique, and that doesn't necessarily go to indicate that because we just came out of a pandemic experience, that all of a sudden we demand universal healthcare. And I think G20, as a multilateral institution, has been engaged in debates in the past on universal healthcare coverage, individual G20 countries as well. So I think the uniqueness of such proposals might come from, say, the perspective of the country, but overall it's also important to think from what the multilateral institution can achieve and what it has deliberated successfully in the past.
I
But
just wanted to add here. So the G20, I think what a lot of people do not realize is that the G20 does not actually have any organization as such to implement this, right?
Mhm.
So the G20 countries, when they agree to something, say it's in health, they will take it to the WHO to actually operationalize it,
Right.
right? So the G20 by itself doesn't really have the resources to operationalize these ideas. It is just that because they are the grouping of the world's biggest economies,
Hmm.
they have that power to kind of leverage existing organizations, right?
Right.
And we see a lot of ideas around, hey, G20 should do this, G20
Hmm.
should do that. But the fact is that the G20 does it through a mechanism, and therefore you have to propose the mechanism.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's very important. And I think the second interesting point was with regards to how in the selection process you would take note of whether there is collaborative efforts from scholars across different institutions or across different countries. So I'm very curious to know what purpose this kind of serves, and especially considering that the T20 made not only objective kind of analyses of what was subjected, but also made substantive interventions, like you mentioned that you had to make an active effort to make sure that biodiversity as a subject, because it's important, it's included. And of course some of that might have come up in the process of the co-chairs giving in comments when some of the abstract was selected, right? So does institutional collaboration or cross country collaboration enhance the process of writing a certain policy brief, or help bring in these perspectives and put the substantive comments made by the T20 into play better than perhaps a single author or a single institutional piece would?
I think so. Multi institutional, whether it is at a domestic level or an international level, just brings in more perspectives,
Hmm.
and that I think is key for a rigorous scrutiny of any idea,
Hmm.
right? The other very pragmatic thing from our point of view is that we were working to very strict timelines, right?
Right.
Which meant that we also had to make sure that the people who were going to write the paper would actually write the paper.
Hmm.
And obviously having multiple authors builds more confidence
Right.
that the paper will be written on time. And that is just a pragmatic thing. It is not about being
Hmm.
inclusive or anything. It is just a little, it's a pragmatic thing that we have to think about.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think multiple, with the minute you have multiple people, it brings, especially if it is cross country, it brings in various perspectives which are very interesting. And we see this across, I mean, international collaborations even outside the G20, right?
Hmm.
The idea is, if you want to create something that you then want to apply to the world, you
Hmm.
can't just have a global north country do it.
Hmm.
You will have to have a variety of voices, and that is why I think it strengthens your proposal when you have multiple.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Right, right, absolutely. And I think this is a very common discussion across academic and policy circles of how some narratives tend to become dominated by, say, global north or Western led countries. And I think to that also, as you said, cross country collaboration and cross institution collaboration might really add a lot of perspective and value. And so, at the culmination of the publication of many of these very very interesting policy briefs, like you said, some of the best that were shortlisted, we also saw that the Think20 published a communique, I think at the end of July, where it picked a set of where it culled out a set of recommendations from a host of these policy briefs, and prepared that communicate to be ultimately submitted for deliberation at the G20. So, Shambhavi, for you, what was that process like? And I think the ideas competition might have become much more elaborate and enhanced in actually coming to the conclusion of a communique. So, what would you please share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was. I think when we went through the final just list of ideas, so we approved all of the ideas that we had to approve. Then we saw all the papers, and there was a
Hmm.
review done for all the papers. Again, by two people in most cases.
Right.
um, and then we finally got a list of ideas that we could bucket under broad topics.
Hmm.
um, and for me it was very interesting because I could see similarities coming through across ideas, in which we formulated as part of the as core tenets for the
Uh-huh.
TF6 communique, which was that if you want to have sustainable development, you have to foster a community centric approach.
Right.
And that means, and community in our case doesn't mean humans, it means a community, it means microorganisms, plants, animals, birds, and humans. And so at the level of governance, you have to think about what the community needs. It might be a biodiversity hotspot where human needs are not really primary, should not be primary. It's the biodiversity needs which are primary,
Right.
right? Second was that technology brings down barriers to collective action. um, Sustainable development obviously requires collective action, and collective action is not easy. I think the best example we have seen of collective action working is the Montreal Protocol in response to ozone depletion, where
Right.
as a globe we decided we are going to move away from using CFCs, and then we could actually repair. We didn't repair, but we could actually halt the damage to ozone, right? And that collective action was enabled by a technology change. And therefore, technology should be used as an enabler for collective action, but it should not be looked at as a silver bullet. It should not be used because it exists,
Right.
right? And we saw various proposals which kind of went back to, hey, let us go back to our old ways of doing things. Let's not unnecessarily use technology. And I think that there is some merit to thinking that, right? And that third was that we have to create a future ready society, which basically meant that we have to build in resilience into our governance systems now. We can't, we now kind of know that COVID like events might occur again and again. So we can't now disregard that and build governance which does not take that into account.
Right.
Okay? So we have to, our current governance has to create mechanisms to adopt to future challenges as and when they come. And we saw this thread running through the ideas, and we picked ideas then which were unique, which brought out something new, which all the chairs and coaches thought were of value, and through their experience had seen them working at, at some level. And those were the ones that were selected for the final communique.
Right, that's brilliant. I think the point on building a future ready society is especially appealing to me. And I think it has something to do with the lines of the philosophy that, we haven't inherited the earth from our ancestors, but we've borrowed it from the future generations. So I think that's again, like I said, especially interesting and appealing. And apart from the policy brief process and the communique, the Think 20 also engaged in conferences and deliberations and meetings. And I think some of the ones that I know about was the Think 20 working group meet in Mysuru, which you were recently a part of. Before that, in January, you were a part of this Inception conference, where you discussed inclusive and equitable digitalization, and how it's important for how it's important for the achievement of the SDGs. So, could you talk a little bit about what the deliberations at these meetings were like, and
Right.
what was your part
So
in
I
it?
think there were quite a few meetings.
Hmm.
All of the organizations from which the coaches or Jays came
Hmm.
had the opportunity to organize their own T20 side meetings if they wanted to.
Right.
There were three main meetings of the T20. One was the Inception conference in January,
Hmm.
then there was a media meeting in Mumbai in May, and then
Right.
the final summit, which happened in August. These were obviously touch points for the task forces to meet and exchange ideas,
Hmm.
for the individual task force members to kind of deliberate on the communique and the abstracts, etc., but also to meet other people, because there was a lot of overlap between the various task forces as
Hmm.
well, so we spent a lot of time also trying to cross pollinate ideas,
Right.
and have broader conversations with experts on some of the topics which had been identified to be the most relevant
Hmm.
for the task forces. So healthcare, for example, in our case, and how digitization might inform on better healthcare.
Hmm.
So a lot of these conversations were a bit more technical in nature,
Hmm.
on how do you derive the best ideas, what is cutting edge right now,
Right.
and then how does that inform our abstract selection process, and then how does the abstract selection process actually inform the ongoing discussion. So I
Hmm.
think those discussions also evolved as we went through the abstract process simultaneously, which was quite
Right.
interesting. But
Right.
Anushka, let me ask you this: you submitted an abstract. How did
I
you
did.
find the process from the other side of the table?
Oh well, yes. I think. It was especially interesting because myself and my co-author Amit Kumar,
You had just joined
hadn't
Takshashila.
we had just joined Takshashila, yes, and we had heard about the Think20's call for abstracts in December last year, and we joined in January this year. But it was and but we never really gave it a serious thought until it was in January this year that we came to the institution, and just 2 days after joining was the deadline for submission, 10th of January, and we were here on the 8th, and. I think that was perhaps the fastest we brainstormed and submitted an abstract for a call for papers. But I think it was one of the best decisions, best academic decisions we've made here, because there's not only a certain degree of pride at the prima facie. It would seem like there's a lot of pride attached with the fact that, oh, you have a recommendation for the G20 and it's now in the Think 20 communique. But it was also about, like you said, thinking of something that's unique and not thought of. So we submitted an abstract under the first task force, which is macroeconomics, trade and livelihoods. Our policy brief talked about reducing data asymmetries to strengthen supply chain vulnerabilities. We also did a podcast 2 days ago on this. The idea behind this was to see, again, COVID was a hot topic and so were supply chain disruptions, but our attempt was to try and find the one node in discussing mitigation of supply chain disruptions that was perhaps least discussed in literature, and again, like you said, touch diverse literatures, and try to make the best of what we can with regards to our capacity to recommend certain sets of actions. And what you talked about at the inception conference also, which is digitalization, we try to give that a focus. And so from the other side of the table, I think that the process was extremely seamless, from the deadline that was followed for the acceptance of the abstract to the comments that were given, and the comments were so beautifully provided. If that was the case for us, I'm sure that would have been the case for all the scholars who submitted their abstracts and proposals. uh, we got comments from, again, two reviewers, and the two perspectives were diverse. And the comments added a lot of value to the recommendations we given, and ultimately when we did submit the policy brief, um, there was, again, to come back to my first point, not just the idea of pride, but also the feeling of satisfaction that this academic endeavor that we had so hastily undertaken and never expected would come to a fruition at the very start
And it got
actually
chosen,
did.
it got reflected in the final T20
uh
communique.
yes. I mean, yes, it did. One, and of course the communique took culled out, like I said, the best points from all of the policy briefs. But yes, the one line that they did a lot to our policy brief was absolutely succinct in kind of trying to explain what the idea was. So yes, grateful for that,
Hmm.
and certainly a memorable experience.
Yeah, I think overall the T20 has been a learning experience. I
Yeah,
think either side of the table.
absolutely.
It is just remarkable on how many people you can actually reach,
Hmm.
how many ideas you can get, and it just there's a lot of hope now for
Hmm.
me that and global action takes time. But I think if we have adequate, if we spend adequate amount of time pushing for good ideas, then eventually they will be executed.
Absolutely. I think I'll have one final question for you, Shambhavi, which is that now, we have the G20 summit under India's presidency to look forward to in a couple days on the 9th and 10th of September. And as you said, the Think 20's work is done a few weeks or months before the summit comes up, the G20 summit comes up, so that the officials have time to deliberate on the recommendations. So, what's the next step for the T20? Next year, the presidency is under Brazil and President Lula. So, has the T20 already begun their work? How will the policy ideas that have been submitted and deliberated on here translate into action in the future?
Right. So this is one of the things that we deliberated on as well. That every year the T20 happens. Every year there's so many good ideas. Some of which we are obviously publicly known through the communiques,
Hmm.
but a lot of which are good ideas which might not have made the final cut, but or might not be relevant as of now, but might become relevant later.
Hmm.
So how do you not lose this knowledge, right? So okay, the first thing I have to say is that the T20 work isn't really finished.
Mhm.
So our communique to the G20 is done.
Mm.
But what happens now is that we still have a few events going on. We have one in November that is planned up for ideas that were received, I think, from T20, but
Right.
for climate change, and these are supposed to feed into one of the larger forums. So there will be more events as we go along. So
Mhm.
that, I think, that continues till December,
Right.
when I think we officially the Brazilian presidency then starts. We actually also then, obviously, as parts of our teams, we had Brazilian colleagues,
Right.
right? So that kind of, and we also had Indonesian colleagues
Mhm.
who came in, which were the La Paz president. So there was a little bit of distillation of ideas, even within the task force. And I
Right.
think Brazil will also make similar kind of maneuvers to kind of have Indian counterparts as part of their team.
Right.
I don't know whether they will do, but I expect them
That's the
to.
hope. Yeah.
Yeah. So that there will be a certain passing on ideas from there. We also had a meeting with the Task Force 6 and Task Force 3 on the silence of the final summit,
Okay.
where we discussed, how do we then take the ideas of life and sustainable development forward. And I think individual collaborations might now start creeping out of this, where we take the ideas forward, maybe outside of the Think 20 forum itself, but the ideas, which is I think the core of what we want to take forward, might now reflect in other sort of collaborations happening. The third is, there was an announcement for a G20 T20 kind of repository, where they're going to create a research forum that acts as a central repository for all of these ideas,
Wow.
so that we don't have to revisit them again and again and again to kind of figure out where they came from.
Right.
So hopefully that will be also operationalized sooner. From my understanding, Brazil might do very interesting things with this presidency. That T20 might focus a lot on international collaborations and
Mhm.
on gender sensitivity, etc. But we obviously have to wait for the public announcement, for the call of abstracts to
Right.
come through, to see what their task forces are, what areas they're going to focus on,
Mhm.
whether life will continue to be a mainstream task force
Right.
uh, for the presidencies. So I think it's going to be an interesting few months to come out. And again, as I said, the T20 is the T20, while tasked with think tanks and academic representatives, the call for abstract is open to everybody.
Mhm.
So it is not that you have to be part of a think tank or of an academic setup to apply, right? So if you think you have a good idea, do apply.
Right.
Do send it in. I mean, the process by itself, as you said, is also, it's also good for your idea and for
Mhm.
you to kind of get peer reviewed ideas, etc., and get published at the end. So I think that once the call is out, we should all be again thinking of ideas.
Absolutely.
And this is the thing, right? Good ideas will need to be reiterated again and again and again and
Mhm.
again and again. And so we need just to keep up that effort, keep up the set the narrative on how the T20 shapes the G20, and the G20 actually shapes the world.
I think this brings me to a, a, a statement, a very interesting statement that once Dr. Vijay Kelkar made at our office, which is that if you'd like to give across an idea to a governmental authority, it might not be noticed if it's mentioned once in a document, but it will definitely not be noticed if it is not mentioned multiple times across multiple documents. So I think with that kind of philosophy in mind, we're all going to be looking forward to the next call for abstracts and to what Brazil has to do with the work streams and the task forces. Um, Thank you so much, Shambhavi. This was a delightful conversation, and I think very interesting experiences emerging from the idea of the Think20 that we've been talking about a lot, but haven't really had the chance to delve into. And also to our listeners, various scholars at the Takshashila institution have had opportunities to write policy briefs. Shambhavi herself has written excellent policy briefs on the Biological Weapons Convention, stockpiles of essential medical supplies, and reducing malnutrition, along with other scholars like Saurabh, Harshit, myself, our Deputy Director Pranay, and Sri Krishna. Right. So please do visit the Takshashila website if you're curious to know about what the policy briefs look like and what the process entails. And thank you once again for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.